and to President Lee Myung-bak of Korea. He has met with all three. The first visitor to the Oval Office was Prime Minister Aso. And as you know, of course, he's spoken to President Hu on the phone and met with President Hu in London. President Obama will be going to China in the fall at the invitation of President Hu, and will make a broader trip to Asia at that time. We haven't worked out the details yet, so don't look for an announcement here on that yet. But we want to be more embedded in Asian institutions and in Asia. Secretary Clinton, when she went to Asia in February, announced that the United States was studying the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with a view to joining. This is something the ASEAN countries have wanted us to do for a long time, and we're now looking at it. Finally, just a few words on President Obama's style of diplomacy. He is pragmatic. He has ideals, but he is not, repeat, not ideological. He's not a name caller. You all saw this during the campaign, and he's lived by the same code as president. Disagreements with foreign leaders will be respectful. He won't be shy about talking about differences, as Dennis indicated when he talked about candor, whether these are on human rights, Tibet, or trade, and won't be shy about taking the necessary measures to defend U.S. interests. But disagreements, which will arise, will not poison the relationship. The president is results-oriented. He is not prone to posturing. He doesn't hop, skip, and jump to the 24-hour cable news cycle. He believes in patience. That's the word he uses all the time on the economic situation. He uses it with us on difficult foreign policy issues like North Korea. He believes in listening. He thinks that we have something to say, but so do the Chinese. Thank you very much.
I think we've had a fascinating set of differing viewpoints on the White House and U.S. policy toward China. We now have time to take some questions from the floor. I think each of your tables has some paper on it. If you would like to write out your questions and pass them, somebody will pick them up, and we'll have a chance to turn to them. While you're organizing your thoughts and thinking of impossible questions to ask, I will kick it off by posing a number of questions for our panels. You've been commenting on U.S.-China policy from the perspective of the White House. A great deal has been written about the secrecy of the Nixon White House in dealing with the State Department, about the tensions between the Carter White House and the State Department under Cyrus Vance. What has your experience been? And I spare Jeff this because there are not enough people confirmed in this administration to know whether they carry out the president's policies. If the president wants to do something with respect to China, how responsive are the other agencies of government in doing what the president wants? Dennis?
I don't think there's any secret that in the Bush first term, there were very differing views among his senior advisors on dealing with China. To oversimplify grossly their positions, Secretary Rumsfeld took a quite negative view of engagement with China and believed we had to prepare, you might say, for the worst with China. Secretary Paal was much more one who believed that the future of China was not that clear and that we could influence and shape where China was headed, perhaps more than Secretary Rumsfeld thought that was possible. What you need to understand about the NSC process is if we do our jobs right at the NSC, what we do is we bring all these views together. And we let the National Security Advisor and the President of the United States hear the views and decide where they want to take the policy. As I was indicating earlier, because President Bush himself had an intellectual interest and curiosity about China, he wanted to hear those debates. And we had rigorous, very tough debates about where to go on China policy. But if the National Security Advisor does their job right, these things can be worked through, and then you get to a reasonable place in policy. But it's very important, and I'm a believer in the quiet National Security Council. The National Security Council that holds its view to the end, lets the agencies of government develop policy options and ideas and bring them to us.
Dr. Lieberthal?
Of course, in the Clinton administration, this was a seamless web with no tension. So I have trouble understanding the basis of your question. But
Thank you for your candor.
My pleasure. So, seriously, the NSC, as Dennis said, pulls together the views of other agencies. Let me add a layer to that. The NSC cannot function without the deep responsiveness, cooperation of the staffs and other agencies. When I was on the NSC, Jeff was one of the people with me in the Asia Directorate, and we had a total of 2 other people to cover all of Asia. So when an issue concerning China came up, you count on the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, and so forth to provide much of the expertise and do much of the legwork that must be done in order to make sensible policy. So this is not, sometimes at the highest level, the press, for obvious reasons, focuses on the big personalities at the top of all of these things. But the reality is that you have a web of relationships underneath that is absolutely core to enabling good policy to be made. And so you get differing perspectives. We at NSC have to represent the president. We're the president's staff. But the reality is if it's not a seamless web, it sure is a machine that has to work very effectively on an ongoing basis across agencies.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I will not speak about what's going on now, but I would like to talk about some past history. Doug referred to the fact that he and I used to speak every morning on the phone when I was at the State Department and he was at NSC. That illustrates how you make it work, but it wasn't merely because we spoke. It was because of the unique quality of the National Security Advisor and the Deputy National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft and Bob Gates at the time, their profound interest in China, their ability to go to the president at a moment's notice to get guidance. And so when I would talk to Doug in the morning, usually if Doug already didn't know what they were thinking, within minutes he would know what they were thinking. And that was vital because the State Department is like a feudal state. There are all these different bureaus with highly different approaches. It's not one feudal state, it's numerous feudal states. And the fights within the State Department about how to proceed are usually unsolvable. But if you have strong presidential leadership, in that case through the National Security Advisor, sitting over at the China desk where I was, you didn't worry about the internal divisions of the State Department because you knew how the president felt. So that kind of presidential leadership was critical. Similarly, under the Clinton administration, I think for the first few years, it was kind of the war of all against all, kind of a little bit of what Dennis was describing in the earlier years as well. But then somewhere around 1995, 1996, the Clinton administration understood that it had to have a more integrated approach, and it really pulled together a White House-led approach to China that prevented these disparate voices with their own agendas from around the bureaucracy from driving policy.
Okay. Doug, do you want to comment? Go to the next question. I think we've beaten this one up.
Every president, when he comes into office, brings a certain set of attitudes on China. They may be quite familiar with China, as in the case of the first President Bush. In some cases, they may have had very limited exposure to China and never visited the country during their pre-presidential period. Could you comment a bit on the flow of inputs to China policy? Does China policy tend to emanate from the White House, or do the agencies come up with policy ideas that flow into the White House for approval by the presidency? What's the balance of that flow? And it can be, you can comment both on how it operates in practice. What is the right balance? Should the White House be the recipient of policy ideas primarily, or should it try to originate the policy ideas? Would anybody care to address that question?
Well, since I took an option out of the last question, I'll join this one. I think that there's a long literature of criticism of the centrality of China policy management, beginning with the secrecy of the Kissinger early missions that has emerged in revisionist writings over the past few decades. And some of it, I remember personally being called down to Senator Helms' office the night before U.S.-China relations were normalized. I was a mid-level CIA analyst. I had no idea we were about to normalize relations with China. But Senator